Good morning. I'm continuing this series of homilies based on the second reading of Advent. I've done this entire season, Advent Cycle C. The first weekend of Advent, it was St. Paul to the Thessalonians, the first letter. Then the following 2 weeks, which was the second and the third weekend of Advent, they were from the letter to the Philippians. And today is from the letter to the Hebrews. It's an anonymous text that, more than a letter, is like a long homily or a doctrinal treatise on the high priesthood of Jesus Christ. And the text is focused mainly on the sacrifice of Christ, and that sacrifice took our sins away once for all. So I decided to title this homily, Sacrifice and God's Will. These are two things, sacrifice and God's will. I believe there is this common misconception that if something is painful, then it must be God's will. And so therefore you have to kind of suck it up, buttercup, and just live with it and offer it up, and it's life, and that's the life you were given, and therefore you just try to live with it. I think we have this common misconception when it comes to pain and sacrifice. I believe that the second reading of today explains well the meaning of sacrifice in regards to fulfilling the will of the Father. And so that's what we're going to look at today. The first of all, the letter to the Hebrews, and really anywhere in the Old Testament, we hear this common theme, almost like a thread going throughout the entire Hebrew Testament. It was the common practice of sacrificial offerings. This was so much part of the life of the people of Israel. It was very common. So for example, if you wanted to receive a favor from God, what you will normally do is that you will make a sacrifice, a holocaust. And with the help of the priest of the temple, you will bring an animal, most likely a lamb, a sacrificial lamb. You offer it on the altar, it was burnt, and then the smoke that will rise up like incense to God's nostrils, and God will smell your pleas and listen to your prayers. This is ingrained in the Jewish mindset. It was so much part of the Hebrew people. And when Jesus came, that was still being happening, because Jesus visited the temple and sacrifices were still being offered in the temple of Jerusalem. And again, the most common animal offered upon the altar of the temple was the sacrificial lamb. So that's sacrifice according to the Hebrew Scriptures. But if we take the word sacrifice and start meditating on it, on our current understanding, what does sacrifice mean in the English language of the 21st century? We mean something quite different. For example, in modern English, we would say that parents sacrifice themselves for their children. That pastors, we hope, sacrifice for their flock. That spouses make sacrifices for one another. That nurses sacrifice many sleepless nights for those entrusted to their care. And the list can continue. Many examples of sacrificial dedication and love. Anything that implies dedication, sweat and tears, that's what we normally in modern English understand as sacrifice. And so now we have to meditate on that second reading of today from the letter to the Hebrews. This is what it is said. Brothers and sisters, when Christ came into the world, he said, "Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you prepared for me. In holocausts and sin offerings you took no delight." He's speaking to the Father. So clearly, the author of the letter to the Hebrews is putting some words into the mouth of Christ. Or he is quoting something that Jesus said in regards to the sacrifices of the temple that God was not listening to. Actually, that's what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 12. If you knew what this meant, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. It's a very common phrase that appears in the mouth of Jesus, and of course is There are plenty of passages in the Old Testament that speak of how God got tired of Israel's sacrifices, empty sacrifices. And so God is constantly complaining because their worship is empty. There is nothing in it. It's just a show. In the Old Testament, we have many quotes of such a thing. The sacrifices of the people of Israel became meaningless to God. For example, Jeremiah, your burnt offerings find no favor with me, says the Lord. Your sacrifices do not please me. Another example, Hosea, chapter 6. For it is loyalty that I desire, not sacrifice, and knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. That's Hosea 6:6. Even though you bring me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them, said God, according to Amos chapter 5. And there are many more passages in which just God kind of had it. And so God just doesn't want to deal with this anymore. I don't want your sacrifices anymore. They mean nothing because you are not putting your heart into them. And the prophets said this message very clear. So why these sacrifices became empty? Why they were no longer meaningful to God? It's because they were a show, they were mere actions. There was no spirit behind them. They sacrificed, but there was no love in them. And so therefore, God is tired of them. But also in the same Hebrew scriptures, we see that this understanding of sacrifice was not all negative. For example, we hear in Psalm 51, the psalmist is praying to God, and he's praying for mercy. And this is what the psalmist says to God. For you, O Lord, do not desire sacrifice, or I would give it. A burnt offering you would not accept. So, my sacrifice, O God, is a contrite spirit, a contrite, humble heart, O God, you will not scorn. So the psalmist realizes that God is tired of the sacrifices. So now he offers his own heart as a sacrificial victim to God. So, what we really here see is a tension that is very real, because the entire religious system of Israel was built upon sacrificial offering, and suddenly God is tired of it. So how do we deal with that, right? And this is where the letter to the Hebrews will take a turn and make a point about the importance of the motivation behind the sacrifice, of what's behind it, what's the intention, what love is behind the sacrificial offering. And the answer to that is doing God's will. So the letter to the Hebrews continues. Then he says, Jesus, behold, I come to do your will. He's speaking to the Father. By this will, we have been consecrated through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all, says the author of the letter to the Hebrews. So really, it's not about the pain that Jesus endured. It's not the amount of blood that Jesus spilled. It's not the countless whips that Jesus received upon his body. None of that is what pleased the Father. Sometimes we think erroneously this. We do not believe in a sadist God. How could we believe in a God like that would delight in seeing us suffering? Instead, what pleased the Father is that Jesus remained faithful. Despite the horrendous circumstances that he got to go through, Jesus remained faithful to the master plan of salvation. That is what pleases the Father. Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, came to do one thing and only one thing, the will of the Father. And the will of the Father is that all of us should be saved through him. The last paragraph of today's second reading of the letter to the Hebrews has a lot to do with what we find in another psalm, which is Psalm 40. Because the psalmist says, speaking to God, sacrifice and offering you do not want, O Lord. You open my ears. Holocaust as sin offerings you do not request. So I said, see, I come with an inscribed scroll written upon me. I delight to do your will, O God. Your law is in my inner being. This is Psalm 40. I delight to do your will, O God. So the psalmist realizes that God doesn't want the sacrifices anymore. So the psalmist now wants to do a different kind of sacrifice, which is, in everything, God, I want to do your will. Accept that as my sacrifice. This Psalm 40 perhaps is the one that the author of the epistle to the Hebrews was referring to, that Jesus was praying. This is what Jesus said, and so therefore he quoted him. Jesus probably learned that Psalm 40, in the synagogue at Nazareth. Probably he learned it from Joseph, as Joseph sat down with him, Jesus as a kid, and memorized the Psalms together. And so Jesus prayed probably this Psalm 40 many, many times, knew it by heart. Jesus comes not as the one that offers an empty sacrifice, but instead as the one who comes to offer his life completely for our salvation, and in everything he wanted to fulfill the will of the Father. It doesn't matter the size of the sacrifice, it's the amount of love. Think of the city of Bethlehem, that was a very small city back then, and it is still a small city. And still, God used that city, the small, to bring forth an exorbitant amount of love, as Micah the prophet said in the first reading. For example, think of the obstacles that Mary had to overcome to go visit her cousin Elizabeth, as we hear in the Gospel of Luke today. Mary was determined to go and see Elizabeth because she needed help, and I'm going to be there for her. God takes no pleasure in seeing a pregnant woman risking her life and the life of her baby in a 120-mile journey through rugged land, exposed to robbers, exposed to human trafficking, exposed to the elements. The journey from Nazareth to the outskirts of Jerusalem, where Elizabeth used to live, that's not a journey for a pregnant mother. It's not the amount of risk that Mary took on that journey that pleased the Father. It's not even the distance she covered and the hills that she climbed, pregnant, to go and help her cousin Elizabeth. All that risk, that gives no pleasure to God. What pleases God the Father is the amount of love with which Mary was determined to go and help her cousin. That's what pleased the Father. She wanted to go in haste to help her pregnant cousin. It is not the long journey that she was doing that pleased God. Despite the risk of the journey, she remained faithful. Fidelity is what pleases the Father. So perhaps this fourth Sunday of Advent may help us to rethink our understanding of sacrifice and our understanding of God's will. First of all, that our sacrifices must never be empty of meaning. That when we come to the one and true sacrifice of the Mass, we don't do it for a show. This is not an empty offering, but actually we bring everything of ourselves and we put ourselves upon that altar, that our sacrifice is not empty of meaning. That God takes no delight in our sufferings, but that God delights in our fidelity to Him, even in the midst of suffering. That's what pleases the Father, fidelity. That our sacrifices only mean something in as much as they reveal the amount of love we have for God and for others. And that we may sincerely say with Jesus, the sacrificial Lamb, "Here I am, O Lord, I come to do your will." Amen.